This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whether your first encounter with Cyberpunk was through Cyberpunk 2077 or the iconic bridge dance clip, Cyberpunk and Cybergoth are subcultures that have always kind of existed with one foot in reality and one foot in fantasy. Bright neon lights, dark dystopian cities, humans merged with technology. These subcultures have a deep and loyal audience. So the question is, how much is real and how much is just fiction? And will this be the subculture of the future? Today, we will explore cyberpunks. So before we get too deep into this, Cyberpunk and Cybergoth are two separate subcultures. For this video, we'll mainly be covering Cyberpunk, but we'll also touch on Cybergoth. And so, our story starts in the realms of science fiction. The easiest way that I can describe Cyberpunk is kind of like the emo of the sci-fi world. The sci-fi genre of books had its golden age around about the 30s to the 50s. This was with authors like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne. Their books would explore themes like time travel, alien encounters, and super advanced technology, and these would lay out the foundations of the sci-fi genre. The prevailing stories of sci-fi tended to focus on a universe that was descending into chaos.
They were undone, destroyed, after all of man's weapons and devices had failed.
But yet there was a trust in science and technology. It was the bright light to save us from our impending doom. And it's very interesting to look at the cultural attitudes of particularly America in the time of the sci-fi golden age. America was coming off of a World War II high, where good beat out evil, through the expansion of technology and uniting global powers against the evil Nazis. This, mixed with the space race between America and USSR, the incredible acceleration of technology in such a short period of time, had the world very optimistic about this technology-backed utopian vision of the future. However, as time passed, things very quickly changed. In 1965, a fellow by the name of Algis Budrys wrote about the golden era of sci-fi, and he said there was a recurrent strain in the golden age science fiction of the 1940s, the implication that sheer technological accomplishment would solve the world of all of its problems. Hurrah! And so by the 60s and the 70s, the very optimistic tropes of sci-fi had worn thin. However much that technology had advanced in the real world, it hadn't gone quite in the utopic way that sci-fi had predicted. Increased surveillance and propaganda were on the rise, and society's attitudes towards governmental power were changing.
No wave of racism can stop us.
There was great social upheaval in USA, with the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, environmentalism, feminism. America was going through some turbulence. There was a questioning of authority and a pushback against the status quo. And so what was happening in the real world started to affect what was happening in the sci-fi worlds.
In the not too distant future, there will be no civilization.
Sci-fi started to become more skeptical and have a dystopic view of the future. They accredited the rise and expansion of technology with environmental problems, an increasing awareness of pollution, resource scarcity. On top of that, in the real world, there was the Cold War between USA and USSR. The whole view that we're all going to hold hands, work together and fight evil, that was kind of a thing of the past, as now America and Russia were threatening each other with nuclear weapons. And so sci-fi saw this increased integration of technology into our everyday lives, leading to a much more negative future, with a loss of privacy through surveillance and a dehumanization of society. And so in the world of sci-fi, the view of the future was getting grayer and grayer, leading to what would be known as new wave science fiction. New Wave science fiction had a more postmodernist attitude, surrealism. It was very political and remnant of the 1960s social movements. The view of the future was much more dystopic, much moodier. Instead of technology solving all the world's problems, it had now become the problem, and it was enslaving us. There was common themes that the natural world was fighting back against human exploitation, and they would often present post-apocalyptic and post-environmental disaster settings. And so instead of exploring intergalactic space, it was more a case that these stories were exploring inner psychological space. It was a unique and experimental writing style. And so as this new wave was growing, the stage was set for an invention of a brand new futuristic subculture, the cyberpunks. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. Squarespace is the #1 platform for building and making your own website. These days, if you don't have a good website, you might as well just pack up business. People make such a quick judgment of what you do based on how your website looks. But lucky for you, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform. With tons and tons of templates to choose from, you can pick any of them and customize them exactly to what it is you do, easy, quickly, and professionally. Along with the templates, they have tons of built-in features, such as email marketing, e-commerce, appointment scheduling. I just once made a website using Squarespace, and I can't believe how easy the whole process was and how amazing the website looks. And to be honest, it was actually quite fun doing it. So be sure to check out Squarespace at squarespace.com/JimmyTheGiant. And to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code JimmyTheGiant. Anyway, back to the video. The phrase cyberpunk was coined in 1983. Bruce Bethke wrote a short story called Cyberpunks. In 1984, a book called Neuromancer would come along with a story based in a dystopian future dominated by massive mega corporations and cybernetics. These books would establish many of the tropes of what would go on to be known as cyberpunk. Advanced technology, artificial intelligence, cybernetic enhancements, and the blending of the physical and the digital world. Cyberspace. From the 80s to the 90s to the early 2000s, cyberpunk and its aesthetic started to influence mainstream, particularly in film and graphic novels. In 1982, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner came out, which brought the aesthetic of cyberpunk to a broader audience. While in 1989, Ghost in the Shell would have a profound impact on the visual aesthetic of cyberpunk, as well as the philosophical themes. And now that video games were becoming more and more popular, you would of course get cyberpunk games. A trend that has continued to this day and would have games like Deus Ex in 2000 and System Shock in 1994. So the best way to describe cyberpunk in one sentence is high-tech, low life, meaning that cyberpunks kind of existed in these gritty underworlds. They would have all of the modern technology like synthetic and enhanced body parts, but yet they would still exist in these criminal reprobate worlds. Their worlds would be set in these brightly coloured neon lit cities, the urban jungles that we would see in films like Akira in 1988, and also the hyper futuristic neon cities and bleak wastelands that we'd see in Blade Runner. But you see, cyberpunk up until the 90s really only existed within fiction. You weren't going to bump into a cyberpunk at the fruit and veg aisle. This would completely change in 1988 with the release of a board game called Dark Future, where they would coin the term Cybergoth. Cybergoths are a real-life subculture. It's a scene that combines elements of goth culture, raver culture, and rivethead culture. And it's quite an interesting one. It latched onto the electronic music scene, which back in the 80s and 90s was kind of the music of the future. They'd be super into these really underground genres like electro-industrial or electronic body music, dark electro, aggro tech, and they were quite separate to your average raver. Most ravers would dress like an 80s VHS fitness instructor, but these lot went for this crazy look that was somewhere between a goth and a cyberpunk. They took the futuristic elements of cyberpunk, such as these body modification, face mask looking goggles, PVC rubber pipes in the hair, which they would call cyber dreads. They would often wear bright neon coloured things, but contrast it against the dark matted gothic black. There was a very clear sexual ambiguity in a lot of the clothing, and as well things like LEDs and technology intertwined into what they would wear. And although it was a very niche thing that you wouldn't see everywhere, it became its own industry. There's shops like Cyberdog, which specialise in this look, and the genres of the music were very dark and gritty and underground, which was very representative of the cyberpunk low-life aesthetic. You know, it wasn't your clean, polished Britney Spears music. These were your real-life, reprobate cyberpunk characters. Well, kind of. The reason I say kind of is because it wasn't really as in-depth as the cyberpunk subculture. Cyberpunk's roots are deep in science fiction with heavy lore and writing around it, and so they would take on broader themes like societal critiques. They embraced activities like hacking, coding, advanced technology, as well with like a political anarchist type of view, an understanding of how technology can both empower but also restrict the individual. It was very critical of corporate power and the ethical concerns around technological advancements. Whereas Cybergoths, they were just about the music, bro. Chill. As well, the cyberpunk fashion was different. It might include more tech wear, leather jackets, neon colours, different haircuts, and cybergoths might have some of the same views of dystopia and stuff like that from the cyberpunks, but really and truly, it's more of just a fun fashion style that's present at EDM raves. However, into the 2000s and up until now, cyberpunk has become a mainstream fixation in terms of film, TV, video games, etc. Blade Runner 2049, Altered Carbon, the Deus Ex game series and the films, and of course, this video wouldn't be complete without talking about Cyberpunk 2077. Now, if you type in the word cyberpunk because you're trying to make a full-length video essay on the matter, you're going to struggle because it will mainly give you results about this video game. The video game, which was a phenomenal letdown on release.
Shallow, empty and lifeless world, lackluster mission design, a messy loot system.
It had previously built up a ton of hype around it by creating this amazing looking cyberpunk futuristic dystopian world. And gamers were keen to dive into this world and get a feel of what it would be like to live as a cyberpunk. And it really took all of the various ideas around what cyberpunk was, the aesthetic and the attitudes, and kind of put it into a potent, condensed form that was a world that you could explore virtually. It is very interesting to see the influence that cyberpunk has had on mainstream culture, because it's so interesting that it sits somewhere between reality and a futuristic fiction. The real world likes to dabble in its aesthetic and its theme. The techwear fashion trend that was really popular for a while, that definitely had some cyberpunk elements. If you go to any music festival, you will often see people who you could argue look like cyberpunks, particularly at festivals that have a heavy influence on dressing up, kind of like Burning Man. As well, in the real world, there are cyberpunk bars and clubs. There are cyberpunk LARPing games. If you don't know what LARPing is, I've made a video on it, check that one out. As well, the cyberpunk haircut of dyed hair and shaved heads. You'll pretty much find that on any good college feminist. It seems that every day the real world is stepping closer and closer and closer to the cyberpunk world. But there are a few things right now that are holding us back from it ever truly emerging as a real thing. A core part of the cyberpunk thing is the merging with technology. Prosthetic limbs, eyes, brain chip enhancements. The idea is to take the human body beyond what it is physically and naturally capable of. But we're getting closer to that every day. I mean, Elon Musk is wanting to put a brain chip in me. The immense rise of AI technology recently. I mean, this video was partly written by AI. Apple's VR, AR goggle thing. As well, when you look at politics and businesses, mega corporations are forming that are getting more and more powerful, bigger than ever. There is a move towards interconnected globalism and a consolidation of international powers. We're having increased climate problems. Technology is being used to clamp down on individuals' freedoms and increase in surveillance. There's a continued growing gap between the wealthiest of society and the poorest.
This summer could get even worse.
If this technology goes wrong, it can go quite wrong.
We are on course for devastating changes to our climate.
It's kind of borderline scary knowing how good it actually is.
All of these things the cyberpunk authors kind of correctly predicted. However, for those of you, like me, who don't consider themselves a doomer, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Life is heavily influenced by the stories we tell ourselves. Some people say that stories are all that life ever really is. Each individual looks at life through their own story. And so the question is, what is your story? Is it a world where good triumphs evil, or where evil triumphs good? Over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a growing sci-fi theme of a rejection of nihilistic dystopian views of the future. And that has come in the form of solar punks. Punk, as a word, effectively means rebellion. And so in a world that is so hell-bent on nihilism, depressing negative views of the future, optimism has become rebellious. Solarpunk understands and sees the concerns of the cyberpunk future, but instead of giving up and losing hope, it keeps a more optimistic view on what the future can look like, working with technology to make a better, safer, and more peaceful world. Solarpunk provides a beautiful inspiration of what the world could move towards. It looks absolutely stunning, and for me, that is a world that I can get on board with. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel and watch this video right here.